Jadi kalau misalkan si pembicara lagi ngomong, kan kalau misalkan cuma dari jauh aja tuh agak bosan ya. Maksudnya jadi kurang dinamis aja. Nah, tapi kalau misalnya pembicara lagi ngomong, mungkin boleh di zoom pembicaranya. Terus kalau misalkan lagi bikin presentasi, kalau PPT-nya bisa di presentasi ini nggak ya, praktis? No. Jadi cokin nggak? Enggak sih. Halo, selamat pagi. Tes, tes. Kita mengadakan seminar. Yang teman-teman semuanya, tolong yang udah di dalam ini keluar dulu untuk kasih presensi dulu ya, absen dulu. Terima kasih. Halo, halo. Masuk ke YouTube? Jelas. Benar. Linknya boleh dicatat saya. Terima kasih banyak, Bapak. Bagi semuanya. A, B, C, D, E. Nomor yang tinggi untuk diskusi. Ya, ini sebuah persiapan untuk teknis. Saya dan buat nanti. Bapak ada persiapan. Gas. sih ya. Iya, sebenarnya dua. Ya, kalau ikut suaranya masuk nggak ya? Boleh. Kenapa? Tuh nanti deh. Oke, jadi harus kayak gini ya. Should I? Should we? Harus kayak gini. Ini udah aman ya? Oke. Soalnya masuk nggak ya ke yang online? Ada teman-teman yang kita online, so boleh dicek nih. Soalnya masuk ya? Iya, aman. Aman. Aman ya? Oke. Baik, selamat siang semuanya. Sekarang sudah 2020, kita agak mundur 20 menit, tapi semoga aman-aman saja untuk teman-teman yang sudah mengikuti dari jam 2 online. Acara akan dimulai. Terima kasih banyak sudah menunggu. Because we're supposed to start at 2 p.m., but then started at 2:15, yes. So I just like to say I'm so sorry for my audience for that. Baik semuanya, selamat datang di seminar nomor kedua dari lab sosiologi. Tapi karena topiknya pun juga sangat berkaitan sama teman-teman tadi, makanya jadi kita buka juga topik. Alhamdulillah kita berbukti baik sekali membolehkan teman-teman kita. Ya, ini baru. Jadi di sini kita sudah. So, halo, teman-teman kita sudah punya tujuh slide terus di sini. Jadi mungkin kalau boleh ditunjukkan sedikit. Ya, CV yang lulus. Ya. Oke, teman-teman akan boleh agak maju ya. Teman-teman baru datang agak boleh dari bang sini, uang. Gimana saya Oke, teman-teman dan sosiologi, selamat datang lagi-lagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang sebelumnya, teman sekalian. Di segmen ketiga, teman-teman sosiologi tahu, jadi dosen di sosiologi, tapi saya baru masuk 2024, jadi masih agak baru juga. Jadi selamat datang buat teman-teman tadi. Halo. Apa kabar baik ya? Alhamdulillah. Oke. Baik teman-teman. Kali ini kita akan bahas soal apa? Judulnya apa itu? Kali ini yang sedikit topiknya apa deh? Oke, intercultural dialogue and social cohesion. Oke, urusan berasal dari teman-teman tahu itu di mana? Tidak? Oke, nggak apa-apa. Urusan akan cerita itu di mana, apa yang terjadi di sana, kemudian apa yang bisa kita pelajari, tapi juga intercultural dialogue and social cohesion yang jauh lebih besarnya lagi, kayak gitu ya. Paling nanti ini acaranya akan dibuat di moderator dan dan usaha akan membawa uh, material dari Kalau dipersiapkan active listening ya, untuk pelatihan listening buat IELTS juga mungkin ada yang tertarik untuk mengambil itu gitu. Jadi ini akan dalam bahasa Inggris tapi secara moderator aku akan mencoba untuk menyampaikan terjemahannya dalam bahasa Indonesia gitu ya. Jadi semoga itu bisa membantu. Mungkin untuk memberikan gambaran juga, aku kebetulan bekerja lebih di, jadi selain jadi dosen di sini sebenarnya lebih ke praktisi. Jadi isu yang aku bahas memang di bagian pengungsi atau refugees yang ada di Indonesia. Jadi pengungsi dari Afghanistan, pengungsi dari Somalia yang paling banyak di Indonesia, Afghanistan, Somalia, dan teman-teman lainnya dari Palestina juga ada, kayak segala macam. Nah, aku kebetulan sudah bekerja dengan beberapa lembaga dan juga dengan teman-teman fungsinya sendiri, ada UNHCR, lembaga PBB yang mengurus institusi di sini di Indonesia, terus lembaga-lembaga lainnya juga. Jadi memang ada banyak hal yang kemudian sudah lebih dari segi peace yang hari ini akan kita bahas, peace, humanitarian, dan development. Kita biasanya mengambil 3 lectures gitu kayak gitu. Mungkin ada yang tertarik untuk masuk ke dunia non-profit yang berkaitannya sama perdamaian, kemanusiaan, pembangunan. Mungkin ada. Oke, satu. Paling satu lah. Yang lain nggak ada. Dari KI pun tidak. Atau masih ekspor. Oke, banyak masalah. Yes. Learn about it, right? Okay. So I will give you oh yeah, that's true. Well, because we don't yes, you can just ask. So the operator name is Salma. You can just like say yes, yes, she will be part of commitment. And then sini kita juga punya baru. Well, until 4 minutes, but then about half an hour, yes. But then so if you want to like feature you, maybe, and then we can have this. Yes, but then you can actually have the yes, they can answer you. Please boleh dijawab ya. Nanti kalau misalnya butuh bantuan, ini untuk saya dengan slide tentang jawab ya. Jadi untuk teman-teman, nanti kalau misalkan ada yang mau nanya atau berkomentar karena hopefully ini akan lebih interaktif, itu silakan aja. Kalau angkat tangannya, terus itu kita bisa ngobrol-ngobrol langsung gitu. Nanti apa untuk okay, so I will. Jadi first of all, I think I will show you a show. Okay, so it looks like you're pretty sure. And so Blue Size specializing in intercultural dialogue, that is for communities and regions of identity and belonging, with particular expertise on Jammu and Kashmir. Teman-teman tahu Jammu and Kashmir di mana? Ya, oke, masih. Coba ke Asia, ke bawah lagi. Kita kan di sini nih, nggak peta dunia ya. Nah, Jammu and Kashmir around di Asia juga. Hah? India, India, dan ya, lu lihat tapi Asia di India dan Pakistan untuk yang sekarang kayak gitu. Jadi usaha itu lebih ke diaspora, teman-teman tahu diaspora ya? Iya, diaspora, kemudian dialog intercultural. Well, this is under an intercultural dialogue in a way, right? And then pertanyaan identitas dan juga belonging, tahu belonging, sense of belonging. Iya, bagaimana rasa memiliki kan betul, rasa memiliki atas sesuatu, terutama misalkan budaya, kayak gitu. Bruce, well, she completed, just completed a PhD, congratulations. Politics and international studies through Coventry University and the Active University. So her research, well, of course, focuses on dialogue, belonging, and equity social connections in conflict affected and fragile context. And that's exactly what we really want to talk in complex German. So I wish I have a lot of experiences. Should we go? About yes. So in the international relations in South Asian University, and the BA economics from Jamia Mills Foundation, right? Okay, so here clarification, and she had several teaching experience along the way. So the teaching associate in Jamia Mills Foundation, on New Delhi. Okay, so in New Delhi, and you should study in company industry, but then you're still in under a company. So this is yes, oh my gosh, I couldn't have this. Okay, so we'll give the stage to Rosa, and she will introduce herself more. Hi, good morning. Dr. Director of Hello, everyone. Something which was not popular topic. This is like all of you, you may still identify as Indonesian. You kind of represent your Indonesian identity, your Muslim identity, your Buddhist identity, whatever you are in the context. But at the same time, all of you also have a globalized identity, which is how you present yourself in the digital world that we now live in, right? Or you are members of the huge virtual community, but obviously not matter anymore. Right? You can be anywhere and which is such a academic and I love what I wanted us to do with this conversation was to kind of pick up from my research in the context that I worked in, which is Jammu and Kashmir, and relate it to the lives that you live in Indonesia and in this globalized world that we all are citizens of, right? So I'm very grateful for all of you who are present here. I'm very grateful to Pika and to your faculty to make sure to make possible this platform for us. So, I what is intercultural dialogue? I just want to give you a very brief introduction of what I mean when I say intercultural dialogue. So if you think about yourself, look around yourself. Indonesia in itself is a huge example of a sociological phenomenon that addresses diversity. How many times have you heard this word diversity? I believe many times, multiple times, right? It's one of the founding principles of the of Indonesia, right? So diversity in itself is a it's a very debated term, and it's been discussed left, right, center. So much of scholarship, so much of uh, intellectual knowledge has been dedicated to discussing diversity, to understanding diversity. Because diversity is something which has affected our communities a lot. And when I say a lot, there have always been diverse communities, but particularly in the post-World War II era, when countries and started forming their own sovereign country, what happened was a mass immigration, individuals from places to the prosperous West, right? There was a massive immigration influx to, to Europe, to the American continent, to places like Australia, to places like Canada. And when these countries in the West were suddenly faced with this influx of individuals who didn't speak their language, who didn't look like them, who didn't follow their religion, the governments and governance modules were suddenly at a loss. And what do we do with these people? How are our societies going to function with this massive amount of difference, right? So difference became a contention. And in the post-World War II era, it was all about frameworks, new ways of governing, right? So what initially happened was they began with diversity management. So, when you think about interculturalism, if you Google it, you will immediately come to approaches about managing diversity. Although I do not, like, I'm personally, but this is how it started off. So, what happened? Like, let me give you an example of the Australian context. Is that they said, fine, you're an immigrant, you're coming into our country, but you're a minority culture, right? You have a minority identity. We, the Australian nationals, already have our own national identity, which is majority. So what you'll do is that you forget all about your identity and become one of us. So they call it assimilation, which is to assimilate completely into the majority identity. So it was pretty unilateral, right? There was no give and take. giving to the majority. Like, was opposition because, eventually these minority identity groups realized that we're losing our culture, we're not able to become a part of the mainstream because differential attitudes, racist attitudes have not changed at all. And this meant that assimilation was not giving the results that policymakers and academics and that governments were looking for. So there is now, let's take a moment, let's be thinking and think about something else. So from this assimilation, we move on to multiculturalism. And multiculturalism basically said to these immigrants, to these minority identity groups that, listen, you can have your identity, but we also want you to respect the identity of the other. You can be a minority identity group, so you have to respect the majority identity. And vice versa. If you're a majority identity group, you have to respect the minority identity. So it's perfectly fine with us if you live your life as a member of your own identity group, but you have to recognize the other majority as well. So when this shift happened from assimilation into multiculturalism, all the policy frameworks they became about recognition, right? As long as I, as a majority identity, or minority identity, as the immigration they allow your mind
conducted that dialogue. that you do not anymore have the identity that you were born with or the identity you feel rooted in. But I don't think that's true. What I feel like, particularly for your generation who have like who are growing in this really globalized era, is that your identities are still very rooted, like you are still Indonesians, because at the end of the day, that's who you are, that's how you're going to present yourself. So, like for me, for example, regardless of where in the world I am, or where I have lived, or where I have been for so many years, if somebody asks me who I am, I still identify shade. And that's my primary identity, regardless of how globalized I may have been in my education or in my interaction. But this is the identity I always fall back on when I have to identify myself, right? So this is what happens that globalization increases intercultural interactions, but at the same time, it does not mean that your identity or your group identity becomes weaker. What happens is that it only becomes layered, right? Now you are an Indonesian, but at the same time, you're also part of this massive digital global virtual world where all of you are essentially watching the same thing, following the same Instagram trends, eating the same food because it went viral. And it's a very different world from the world I lived in when I was probably an undergrad student, right? So it's very your class 5 years from now, the experiences that you would share with me would be very different from the experiences that my participants from 5 years back had. And it's just these 5 to 10 years which have caused this really massive transformation in the way intercultural interactions are shaped. Like I said, digital spaces connect you so much, and so does migration. And I think your very good lecturer figure would have better understanding of how migration is literally transforming the world in ways which it has never seen before. And it's not like migration hasn't been happening. Migration has been happening for centuries and millenniums. But the way migration is happening now in this globalized world is having far greater consequences than it has ever had. So if you pick up your phone, I was going to say a newspaper, but nobody reads the newspaper anymore. But if you pick up your phone and if you're browsing news, you will find that migration is mentioned so many times by leaders across the world. Trump was going to build a wall, and the people in the industry they went ahead with Brexit and effectively closed the borders to other European countries, and now they're like trying to develop this kind of policy framework which is not very pro-immigrant, right? So it's a thing which is going hand in hand with how uh, governments and societies and people and individuals and practitioners and scholars are approaching diversity. And as students of international relations, it's very important for you to kind of get acclimatized to these conversations. So this will bring us back to the most important and inherent human thing, which is to interact. See, no matter where we are, what we do, how we identify, there's something extremely inherent about our willingness and our inherent need to be in interaction, to talk to people, right? We want to talk to people, we want to interact, we want to socialize. And because of this inherent human character, dialogue becomes such an important tool to address any of the challenges that today's globalized world presents us with. And now, we're not just living in diverse societies, we're living in societies which are super diverse, right? You have all sorts of people with all sorts of identities, with languages, with cultures, with what do you call it, the races they belong to, the ethnicities they inhabit. It has become such a super diverse societies where people now live. Like for example, if you If you go to any of these really cosmopolitan cities, for example, let's talk about London. It is so cosmopolitan at the moment. Like if you think about London, like 4 5 decades back, you wouldn't have been probably able to find an Indonesian restaurant. But now there are Indonesian restaurants everywhere in Chinatown. So that's also interesting. There's a Chinatown in central London, and there are Indonesian restaurants there. So you can have your nasi goreng in sitting in central London. So that's all about globalization. That's all about immigration. These Indonesians have come up and set shops, and they're flourishing, right? And of course, they have their own issues, but they are also part of the framework that I am talking about. How is it that they are included in the society? How is it that their voices are heard? How is it that they can be represented? And how is it, if there are any tensions between them and other groups, that those tensions can be addressed? Identity. So there are three key terms that I would want you all to think about. Now, one of them is identity, the other one is belonging, and then we have the big term globalization, right? It's thrown around so casually. And even with my students, when I teach international politics, I always have to tell them that, take some weight off this word, try and understand what this word means. And when you try and understand what this word means, you'll understand how everything that is a part of intercultural dialogue, of intergroup dialogue, kind of comes down to how our identity and belonging now is functioning and negotiated in this globalized world that we live in. So, like I said, just because you're more exposed to global culture, through virtual media, through internet, through your digital media, does not mean your own identity is going anywhere. So just because you belong to multiple places at the same time, it does not mean that you belong to one place more and you belong to the other place anymore. Globalization has only and only added more complexity to your identity, to how you belong, and to how you choose to belong. So, what globalization has essentially done is that it has made our identities, your identities, my identity, very complex, very layered. It has shaped how communities now function. And you need to think about it, because as students today and leaders of tomorrow, you need to understand that what globalization is doing to your generation, to us, and to us as academics. It's a matter of, it's a matter of great contention to understand that, how globalization can be worked into all of these debates, and how now with the use of AI, everything has become even more complex and even more there. You no longer can gatekeep knowledge. Right? Everybody has access to all forms of knowledge. So even the institution of university is under threat. Because you no longer need an expert like me to teach you about intercultural dialogue. You can just go to whatever AI is used in Indonesia the most, your I don't know, ChatGPT, your Gemini, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I don't need to listen to her. So that gatekeeping was low. So that has massive consequences for everyone, right? So these things have forced us to think about where do we situate these identities, and then how do we bring it into cultural dialogue. So can we have the next? So I think I did give you a very brief intro into why I kind of studied general English A, because I'm from there, and B, because it's such an understated and understudied and complex place to understand diversity. And like I told you, it's very culturally and linguistically diverse place. And these communities, these cultural groups that I talked about, they carry multiple histories. Each cultural group has its own sense of history, has its own sense of experiences, cultural experiences, right? Because they we all have different perspectives. So the groups that we come from, the way we look at things does not have to be the same way that another group might look at a similar situation. It's a matter of subjectivity, perspectives, and experiences. So this case study, my native place, for me formed to be a very useful sociological point of view to understand intercultural dialogue in fragile and precarious contexts. Slide. So this brings me back to how did I operationalize ICD? So it was a bit difficult to get all of these different communities from Jammu and Kashmir to the table back in their homelands, right? So what we instead did, what my research team, my supervisors and myself instead did was that we we kind of tried to find a sneaky way of doing intercultural dialogue, right? You have to be innovative when you do research. So, does anyone want to do research? Does anyone want to get into research? Anyone wants to? Does anyone want to get? Oh, you do. So if anyone amongst you, does anyone want to get into research? No one. My God, do we have such bad names for research? Nobody, you want to get into research? Okay, perfect. And you do. Say, so that's fine. I'm happy that two people also want me to get into research. It's a long commitment, so I understand. But if you want to get into research, and not just research, like if you want to get into even policy making, or you want to work with the government, there are certain things which I always feel that students should know and students should understand, and that is what will set you apart from someone who knows everything, even in the era of AI, is that you know how to do things, right? So if you know how to conduct intercultural dialogue, no matter the kind of sophisticated AI anybody places against you, they're never going to figure out how to do intercultural dialogue or how to conduct research. So it's only the human mind that can think about ways to go about certain situations which are not as commonplace, which are fragile and which are complex. So what we did with Jammu and Kashmir was that, okay, we acknowledged the fact that we will not be able to probably do it back in homeland. And there were also other things like we had COVID, so it was anyhow very difficult for us to travel, for me to travel. And to get these people together, it was a challenge of its own. So we decided and agreed upon doing it in the diaspora. And the diaspora, as you know, is a space where these communities from Jammu and Kashmir exist, but they again exist in parallel with each other. They do not interact. And this was also something which was another challenges, but also a scholarship gap that was identified, that these cultural groups had never interacted with each other. They had never been in a conversation with each other. So we picked up the diaspora as a safe, alternate dialogic space where everyone had equity. No, there was no minority group, no majority group. They were all in a host country. They were all immigrants. So in a way, they were all equal and similar before the government. So there was a sense of equity when bringing together these groups who had otherwise a very long history of intercultural affair and intercultural mistrust. So this is what we did, that we allowed the diaspora to be used as an alternate dialogic space. And this allowed them to kind of come together and have a conversation in more equitable environments. So, like I said, those interested in research, this might be interesting to you, is that The research design was again one of the challenges because, like I said, there was not a precedence to how you can do intercultural dialogue practically. So you kind of had to start everything from scratch because you couldn't go and read papers and try to understand how someone had done ICD intercultural dialogue and kind of try and replicate it. So you were creating a framework. I was creating a framework for intercultural dialogue. So what I did was that we developed a research design which required me to first go and understand everything that already exists in my research field, right? All the conversations that have happened, who are the people who want to, who are visibly into dialogue and who would like to talk. If dialogue has happened, where and how, if it hasn't happened, why hasn't it happened, right? So we did this in one part of the methodology, which we called the formative part. And then once I had answers to all these questions and I figured out that there had to be a set of parameters for people to be brought into dialogue, then that's what we did next. And we conducted intercultural dialogue as the third step of research design, which was through focus groups. And it was these focus groups which then explored what I just introduced to you, which is how trust developed, how perceptions changed, and how communication reduced the interpersonal fear, the interpersonal mistrust that otherwise existed between these cultural groups. Now, a very important thing that I want you people to think about is that dialogue does not always have to be about consensus. If you go back to the definition of ICD that I just discussed with you people, I said that we should not remain fixated with the idea of having a solution. When you free yourself as a researcher, as a mediator, as a negotiator, as a dialogue practitioner, from this demand of developing a solution, what you do is that you open up avenues for unrestricted communication. Now, unrestricted not in the sense that people can be abusive towards each other. No. What I mean is that people are more open because there's no burden of coming to a negotiation, coming to a consensus, coming to a solution. You're there just to talk. I just want you people to talk to each other. And of course, I had prompts, the things that they could talk about. But at the same time, I was not controlling the conversation. So I gave agency. I gave complete agency to my participants. And so they were not burdened by the idea. I was not burdened by the idea of getting to some big agreement or like solving some problem. So what actually happened then, what I banked on was something that I then called relational transformation, which again, as I said, was measured by trust and by empathy. So these people showed a sense of relational change in regards to each other. They had started off as being mistrustful of each other. And many times I would have participants cancel on me like 10 minutes before I was supposed to do a focus group because they were simply not, they didn't trust. Sometimes they didn't trust me, sometimes they didn't trust the participants. They didn't know what was going to happen. Like I said, there's a history of conflict and there's a history of fear. So they would give in to fear and they would not want to interact, which is fine. Participants have every right to kind of withdraw. So that's what they do. But regardless, I was able to still conduct the focus groups that I did, and I was still able to conduct ICT with those who were willing to be open, willing to be respectful, willing to have an exchange. And that's what we did. And what we observed was that relationships do transform, even if there is a precarious history, even if there is decades and decades of mistrust, decades and decades of fear. If people sit with the intention of being open, of being respectful, there will be a relational transformation. And my research is a testimony to that. We were able to conduct successful ICD in a context which was precarious, in a context which was non-Western, in a context which did not have any precedents. And we were able to do it successfully. Although the scope was small, it wasn't like I was interviewing hundreds of people or doing God knows how many focus groups. It was a small scale because that's was the scope of my PhD thesis. But even with its limited scope, the impact and the outcome that it had was fairly positive considering all the things that we were up against. And the trust that I observed during these focus groups was also reflected in something that I did post to these focus groups. So once these focus groups would end, all of my participants, I would give them, do you know what questionnaires are, right? Questionnaires. So they would get anonymous questionnaires that I would know who has filled it. Like, so you do this online, and they were asked certain questions. And one of the questions in the questionnaire was that I wanted to know if they would be willing to engage again in a similar conversation like this. This was a way for me to understand if whatever I had done had created a possibility in their mind for future contact, right? Which would have meant, in a way, that attitudes did change positively. They now trusted each other. And I mean, I would say that that was also another major indication of the success of intercultural dialogue was that majority of my participants wanted to meet again. And although I couldn't do it again, like, because beyond the scope of my PhD, but over the years I received photographs from the people I had introduced during focus groups, and they have built friendships out of my research, and they're friends with each other. Right? Earlier, they wouldn't barely speak to each other. They would speak to each other. But now, because the participated in a focus group, they wanted to stay in touch. They have certain common interests, whatever things they want to work on. And they've been friends. So I still get photographs to this day of people having met each other. And, my research is, fairly close now. So it's about this, that how this trust building and then became the basis for future engagement. Now, as we discussed, and I've been saying over and over again, that not just to the context where I applied intercultural dialogue, in any context which is precarious, in any context which is fragile, and in any context which is now subjected to the consequences of globalization, there is a lot of challenges that dialogue faces. And some of these challenges are the challenges that define that precarity, like we talked about historical mistrust, about fear, about stereotyping, about lack of safe and equitable spaces of expression. And this is where your innovative nature as a researcher, as a policymaker comes in. You figure out ways to address that fear. You figure out ways to address that exclusion, that stereotyping, and then you think of ways where you can provide your context, your field, your participants a safe space to engage in dialogue. So I think we've already discussed some of this, that the research found that the participants did react positively to respectful engagement, and what they valued the most was being heard, right? So this takes us back to the definition I had, which was about being respectful, about being open, about reciprocating the respect that you were receiving, and that sustained contact would encourage openness to future interaction, which is what is happening. Some of them are already friends, and majority of them wanted to participate again, which was I had a really hard time getting people to come to these focus groups. But after the focus groups were over, in those anonymous questionnaires, majority of my participants, like I would say more than 90% of my participants wanted to participate in similar focus groups again. So there was a lot of power in that statement. It was very powerful when you look at it from the perspective of how challenging the process had been to design. And then the outcome was positive. We had successfully tested ICD. I would say it was worth the time. So I want us to take it back to where you're from and where we are standing right now, which is Indonesia. And I was introduced to Indonesia by my mentor and my supervisor, Professor Mike, who I was expecting to be there, but yeah. So, anyways, so he introduced me to Indonesia. He had been a diplomat here with the British Embassy and then came back as an academic. So when I was first introduced to Indonesia, I was really, really amazed by the kind of diversity that Indonesia has. There's religious diversity, there are thousands of islands, there's linguistic diversity, and the fact that one of the foundational principles of Indonesia is unity and diversity. It is so important for you as young Indonesians to realize how important dialogue is to sustain this diversity, to manage this diversity, and also to positively see how this diversity can be an asset to you, to your generation. So what dialogue can do is that it can help you understand the different cultural identities that prevail in your country and how you can best utilize them, right? How you can best serve the principle of unity in diversity. And to be able to serve the principle of unity and diversity, you don't only have to recognize this diversity, you also have to make sure that this diversity is in interaction with each other, right? As we just talked about. And this is where you would come to think about. I had a lecture this morning and somebody asked me a question about, so how can we do this in Indonesia? And I said that, you should be telling me how can you do this in Indonesia. What I can do is that I can bring in my methodological expertise, but context expertise is yours. Nobody knows Indonesia better than all of you, right? For example, nobody knows Indonesia better than I do because I'm an insider. And nobody knows Indonesia better than all of you sitting here. So I will come in with my methodological expertise, but you will have to come in with your context-sensitive information. You can be future PhD students or researchers will work on the Indonesian context and have outcomes which will be very specific to your context, but also equally important, right? So dialogue should be context sensitive and it should be community informed. And that intercultural understanding will strengthen social cohesion. And the most important outcome is that human connection, human interaction is still very central to coexistence. People still want to speak to each other. People still want to have a connection. Which is why, why do we keep going back to our social media? To feel connected to the world, right? And that's inherently human of us, to want to feel connected. And that becomes more important when you live in a society where connection is very connection is very limited, maybe sometimes to other groups, and sometimes even within groups. So human connection is extremely central to coexistence. And I do not think no matter how advanced technology becomes, no matter where AI reaches, whatever happens, no matter if people start adopting robots into their families, we will still strive and carve for that, and we still want human connection. So what I want us to think about before we kind of close down on today's conversation is that it's very easy to kind of think that diversity may always produce conflict. It's not really a good for diversity to always produce conflict. I mean, of course, it can be one of the reasons why there is conflict, but that does not always necessarily mean that it will produce conflict, particularly intergroup conflict. So what we can do to kind of not give any chance for that diversity to develop into any kind of intergroup conflict is to introduce dialogue at a very early stage, is to introduce intercultural dialogue, intergroup dialogue at a very, very early stage. And if you have dialogue between communities, if you have interaction, not only recognition between communities, what you are doing is that you're not giving space for that diversity to then develop into conflict. So what intercultural engagement will do for you is that it will take you away from simply saying, like I said, I'm amazed by the diversity in Indonesia. And you can move from saying you belong to saying that how do we belong together, right? How all of us can belong together. And that in itself, I believe, is a very powerful way for you as Indonesians and for myself to look at how all of us can continue to coexist together in a world which is so highly globalized. And this is how we can continue to work towards managing diversity positively, making sure contact is positive, or making sure that there is contact, and then we figure out if it's positive or not. And at the same time, it's very, very important for you, for me, for you particularly, as like I said, students today, leaders of tomorrow, to understand that we as citizens of this globalized world need to move beyond simply saying that you belong. We need to ask together, all of us, then how do we belong together, right? Thank you.
Terima kasih. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa. I have so many occasions. Oh my gosh, well, I will try to summarize it, which is something that is very difficult. It is such a fact that all of the parts, I think I got a lot of it. Oh, thank you so much. But then, so I will try to summarize. Aku akan mencoba untuk ngasih ini ya, kurang lebih dalam bahasa Indonesia ya, butuh teman-teman? Butuh, baiklah. Oke, jadi sebetulnya cukup panjang ya. Jadi kalau nanti kita setelah ini pun akan membagikan si PPT untuk kalau misalkan untuk teman-teman ada banyak yang membutuhkan ini juga ya. Jadi sebetulnya usaha karena dari Jammu dan Kashmir, kalau misalnya teman-teman tahu Jammu dan Kashmir itu kita sederhanakan sebagai daerah yang jadi daerah sengketa antara India dan Pakistan. Kayak gitu. Ada di daerah lainnya juga, tapi itu adalah daerah yang cukup banyak konfliknya karena karena orang-orang tinggal di sana itu cukup diverse dan jadi kontestasi dari negara-negara yang memang punya perbatasan di sana. Kayak gitu. Ini mungkin teman-teman nanti aku tidak tahu di mata kuliah yang akan banyak membahas itu atau tidak, tapi memang kalau ketika kita ngomongin borders ataupun batasan negara itu banyak hal yang terjadi di sana ya, kayak gitu. Ini nanti teman-teman sosial baru akan belajar beberapa minggu lagi, paling tidak di sosiologi pendidikan, tapi itu yang terjadi. Nah, Jammu dan Kashmir ini ada di perbatasan, ada di borders. Makanya jadi ada banyak konflik di sana. Nah, tapi kemudian tentu saja belajar di UK, kemudian banyak mendapatkan studi kasus itu dari studi kasus negara-negara kayak gitu. Tapi makanya belum ada betul-betul anggaplah tes ya. Studi kasus atau cara untuk membangun dialog antara orang-orang yang datangnya bukan dari negara-negara kayak gitu. Terutama dari tempat-tempat konflik yang memang basisnya di kita nyebutnya kalau teman-teman itu global south ya. Yang teman-teman sosiologi kan juga dengan istilah itu mungkin. Jadi itu makanya kemudian usaha PhD-nya mencoba untuk memikirkan metodologi apa ya kemudian akan sukses dalam konteks Jammu dan Kashmir ataupun negara yang non barat ini kayak gitu. Jadi pertama-tama makanya Rosa tadi menyampaikan kepada kita seberapa beragamnya Jammu dan Kashmir itu. Karena kalau misalkan dari narasi yang diketahui secara umum biasanya Jammu dan Kashmir yang tinggal di sana Muslim kayak gitu. Tapi sebetulnya tidak. Ada orang-orang Hindunya juga, ada Sikhnya juga, dari cara hidupnya pun juga berbeda-beda. Bayangkan kalau misalkan di Indonesia pun juga ada ya orang yang tinggalnya di dekat pantai sama orang yang tinggalnya di dekat di gunung misalnya, itu kan kadang-kadang karakternya berbeda. Terus jelas maksudnya secara bahasa di Indonesia kita pun beda-beda ya gitu. Orang Sunda punya bahasa Sunda,
Dan untungnya kalau misalnya kita ada Yunani, ada Unified language-nya, yaitu bahasa Indonesia, kayak gitu. Jadi kita masih ada apa ya? Kita masih bisa bicara satu sama lain, tapi dalam konteks Jammu dan Kashmir karena dia sangat berdekade banyak konflik di sana, kayak gitu. Jadi tentu saja yang namanya sense of identity yang belongnya terhadap bahasa masing-masing, terhadap budaya masing-masing itu jauh lebih kuat kayak gitu. Makanya jadi usaha lagi-lagi berpikir seperti apa intercultural ataupun bagaimana usaha membangun perdamaian di tempat yang seperti ini kayak gitu. Kemudian beliau melihat juga dari bagaimana dunia kita sekarang seperti itu ya, bagaimana sekarang boleh kita bilang kita punya super diverse community, komunitas yang sangat-sangat beragam kayak gitu. Karena bukan cuma lagi-lagi teman-teman, aku yakin kalian sekarang tidak lagi mengidentifikasi identitas kalian sebatas misalkan oh aku perempuan, aku laki-laki kayak gitu, tapi kalian juga mengidentifikasi diri kalian dari berbagai hal gitu. Ada yang suka K-pop, ada yang suka film, ada yang suka apa kayak gitu. Jadi kita bilang diverse identity itu dari sana, bahwa yang namanya identitas, bagaimana kemudian kita merasakan identitas kita, lalu bagaimana kita merasa belong kepada identitas tertentu, itu sekarang juga jadi sangat super diverse kayak gitu. Tapi tadi Yo bisa menyampaikan bahwa biasanya memang identitas itu dibentuk dari budaya, dari memori, dari bahasa, dan dari life experience. Life experience tahu ya, jadi pengalaman kalian kan sudah hidup nih berapa tahun, 20-an tahun kurang lebih, dan kan kalian punya pengalaman sudah hidup ya, mohon maaf gitu. Nah, itu adalah pengalaman hidup kita yang kemudian membentuk kita juga siapa kita, kayak gitu kan. Jadi urusan lagi pengen mencoba melihat juga, karena lagi-lagi masalah yang ada di Jammu dan Kashmir adalah bagaimana orang-orang merasakan sense of belonging mereka bisa jadi beda-beda kayak gitu. Karena pengalaman hidupnya tadi juga beda-beda dan beragam. Jadi karena belum ada metodologi yang jadi belum ada metodologi praktis yang kemudian bisa diadopsi secara gampang, anggaplah untuk konteks seperti ini. Makanya Rosa harus membangun sebuah metodologi dari awal, metodologi intercultural dialog kayak gitu ya. Makanya jadi makanya tadi Rosa bilang dia punya expertise di metodologinya, karena itu pun yang utamanya sedang dia bangun. Terus basis frameworknya tadi kalau misalnya teman-teman ada yang dengar itu outward contact theory. Mungkin teman-teman ada yang pernah dengar? Belum, ya udah. Jadi ada outward contact theory, itu juga banyak dibahas. Aku juga belajar diskriminasi. Jadi outward contact theory ini secara paling sederhananya adalah untuk pada akhirnya kita bisa membangun, anggaplah jembatan komunikasi antara orang-orang yang punya keberagaman itu, maka mereka harus kontak, mereka harus bertemu kayak gitu. Tapi yang tadi Yusuf bilang, yang namanya kontak itu tidak selalu positif gitu, iya dong. Ada orang yang tadinya belum pernah ketemu, habis itu pas ketemu malah berantem. Ada orang tadinya cukup suka antara satu sama lain, kayak misalkan kamu nggak punya sentimen negatif apa-apa ya tentang satu orang, terus karena kalian ketemu malah jadi lebih jelek kayak gitu. Nah makanya jadi ada banyak kemungkinan dalam kontak ini, dan tadi pun terutama ketika orang-orang yang harus dipertemukan adalah orang-orang yang memang sudah punya sentimen atas satu sama lain ya kan. Orang-orang yang tadinya dan menjadi diaspora Jammu dan Kashmir, mereka paling tidak sudah cukup tahu apa yang terjadi di sana, dan pada itu mereka pun juga punya sentimen atas orang-orang lainnya yang identitasnya cukup berbeda dengan mereka kayak gitu. Jadi makanya tadi Rosa bilang susah sekali untuk mengumpulkan orang yang mau ikutan FGD ini kayak gitu, karena kan dia memang fokusnya lebih di FGD untuk metodologi penelitiannya kayak gitu. Jadi tapi kemudian indikator untuk pertemuan ini sukses itu apa sih gitu. Jadi yang pertama adalah indikatornya bukan pada akhirnya mereka itu bisa saling setuju satu sama lain, nggak harus kayak gitu. Yang paling penting adalah mereka ngerti satu sama lain secara hormat. Jadi agree to disagree gitu pun nggak apa-apa teman-teman. Jadi kontaknya ini oke, paling tidak mereka mau terbuka untuk saling mendengarkan, mau terbuka untuk merespek satu sama lain, dan yang paling penting dari proses juga adalah paling tidak mereka menunjukkan ada empati gitu. Empati itu apa definisinya? Mengempatkan diri kita pada perspektif orang lain kayak gitu ya. Meskipun kita tidak begitu memahami atau setuju dengan perspektif orang lain, itu kan paling tidak kita bisa mulai melihat perspektif mereka seperti apa, kayak gitu kan. Jadi paling tidak itu yang jadi ukurannya. Tadinya Rosa pengen mencoba itu di jagoan Kashmirnya langsung, tapi kemudian kita oh, are you okay?
I'm fine.
It's fine.
Don't worry, come to the outside.
Oke, jadi tadinya pengen di jamuan Kashmir, tapi kemudian karena COVID-19 ya, jadi susah untuk pulang segala macam. Jadi akhirnya dilakukannya di Vietnam sekarang. Aku kayaknya perlu mengkonfirmasi satu hal ini. So I'm so sorry. So you did the research in UK since you sleeping to go away, right? Okay. Jadi untuk diaspora jamuan Kashmir yang ada di UK itu yang dilakukan. Jadi di diaspora itu dan kelebihan biasa kan ini gambaran penelitian gitu loh guys, kan biasanya kalian kayak pengen melakukan penelitian, tahu nih informasi dari mana, kan ternyata ada hambatan, jadi kalian harus nyari lagi kan caranya. Nah ini caranya Indonesia adalah diaspora, dan kelebihan dari diaspora adalah at least mereka menjaga emotional ties, kebayang ya, koneksi emosional kepada rumah, apapun itu rumahnya. Kalau di sini kita ambil konteksnya jamuan Kashmir, lalu yang jadi kelebihan mereka bertemu di luar jamuan Kashmir adalah karena jaraknya, gitu. Maksudnya kalau misalkan bayangkan kalau kalian punya konflik sama Malaysia, terus kalian itu harus diskusi sama orang-orang Malaysia tapi di Malaysia, kan agak menyeramkan ya. Maksudnya itu adalah gitu. Tapi makanya ketika diaspora ini ditemukan di ruang yang lebih netral, bukan di tanahnya mereka ya, tapi di UK, karena UK itu kan mereka statusnya sama semuanya, orang-orang kebanyakan imigran dari diaspora, kemudian itu anggaplah tanah yang lebih netral dibanding langsung di jamuan Kashmirnya. Nah makanya aku sebetulnya cukup penasaran sama Mursa, bagaimana ya kalau misalkan kita lakukan interaksinya itu justru di tempat di mana konflik itu terjadi kayak gitu, karena pasti akan cukup berbeda. Atau kalau misalnya dilakukan di UK itu ada jarak ya kan, ada jaraknya sehingga orang-orang mungkin bisa lebih netral, terus orang-orang bisa berefleksi tanpa ada immediate conflict pressure tadi dibilangnya. Jadi bayang ya, ada tekanan konfliknya langsung tuh ada jarak lagi-lagi kayak gitu. Terus akhirnya saya membangun practical guides dari scratch, lalu dari orang-orang yang tadi sudah terkumpul dengan kerja keras yang luar biasa itu. Jadi setelah FGD dilakukan, berusaha menyebarkan questionnaire anonymous. Jadi mereka silakan isi, lalu mereka tinggal salah satu pertanyaannya adalah apakah mereka setelah FGD ini masih mau untuk berkontak ataupun berinteraksi dengan tadi lawan bicaranya pas FGD atau tidak, kayak gitu. Dan ternyata mayoritas mereka mau untuk melakukan, dan bahkan ada beberapa yang membangun pertemanan setelah itu, kayak gitu. Jadi coba menarik ya sebetulnya. Ada dari teman-teman yang mau bertanya sekarang, is there anyone who wants to provide patience, like asking questions to the speaker? I'm surprised. But then, of course, it's difficult for you to correct me because I'm afraid of the correct things to the audience. Ada yang mau nanya? Boleh kita? Mau dalam bahasa Inggris atau bahasa Indonesia? Bahasa Inggris, okay. So, is it okay if I open the occasion?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to collect it? Just like 2, 3. Yeah, now we have one, but usually if one asks Asian and then she finish and then you answer, and the others can kind of like,
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes. Okay, all right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Hira. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I really relate to what have you said earlier about trust, openness, and respect is being the foundation of genuine interaction, right? So this has been also been my struggle, especially in college environment. Like, how do we actually gain trust from other people when others are already being skeptical? to one another, right? So this has been my struggle, and I want to ask you personally, how do you deal with that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, you want to answer them? Okay. Oke, mau Cohesion, ada lagi mau tanya? Boleh, oke. Silakan ya. Yes. Namanya juga ya?
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. Hi, Miss
Urusan.
Urusa. My name is Ali. I'm from IR. So I have two questions actually, but the other is kind of related to the first question from her. Yeah. So maybe I'll start with the first question. So can intercultural dialogue only be carried out by non-state actors, for example, such as society actors or diasporas and others? Or can states also use it to resolve their conflict and create peace through maybe diplomatic approaches? So that's my first question. And then, kind of related to the question before, you said that intercultural dialogue can be implemented in the Palestine-Israel conflict, but with one of the ways is giving them a safe place to talk. But with how they are still attacking each other, mostly from Israel, shouldn't that make them not want to talk with each other? Plus, with the historical mistrust and the fear. Therefore, what happens when they don't want or willing to talk? Is intercultural dialogue can still be implemented? Thank you.
Thank you. Lanjut. Ada lagi yang mau bertanya di sini? Yes, oke. Jadi kalau ada yang mau come up dengan question silakan ya. Tapi kita jawab dulu pertanyaan dari Firman. Yes.
So your question. Thank you so much for your lovely question. I think trust is not something that you can. It's not like you're gonna snap your finger and people are going to trust you, right? It's a very gradual process. So if I look at my own research experience, the way I approach trust is how it develops over stages. So I look at it as a process rather than as a destination, right? You cannot say that, I talked to this person today and now I suddenly trust them. It's not like that, no? It's also the content of your conversation. What did you talk about? How was it that you felt discussing something, right? And it's not just in the context that I did, but like you mentioned your own, like in your college environment. It's difficult. I understand. I've been there. So it's like, it's about how you progress from, first you have to start the journey from mistrust. So if you do not start that journey, you're never going to get to trusting somebody. So you have to be willing, right? It has to start with that willingness. It has to start with that openness. So you have to be willing to carry on a conversation. And then you have to be open enough to listen to them and not just be like, no, I'll talk and you listen. That's not happening. Like there has to be reciprocity. So you talk, I listen, and then I'll talk and you listen. So you go through these stages of respect, mutual respect. It's very important that the respect is mutual. It's not like you just being respectful and the other person is like, downright being abusive towards you or not reciprocating that respect. So you start off from somewhere. And once you start off that journey from mistrust, once you listen, once you develop something that I refer to as intersubjective empathy, right? You feel empathetic towards the other person, right? Once you begin to understand their position and they understand yours, you automatically get to a point where you trust them, right? Because I think the most important things that human beings can do for each other is to be empathetic, right? Empathy is a very important thing. So once you feel that the other person is empathetic towards your position, they have empathy for who you are, what you're going through, what you've been through, and why you are the way you are, or why you have the opinions that you do, you will automatically trust them. That happens. Most of the times it happens, well, I don't know, maybe it might not sometimes, but most of the time it does. So what you have to do is start that journey, and it's a process. You cannot just snap your finger and trust someone, right? And the second question. Yeah, you know. Yeah. Thank you for your questions. So your first question was see, this is why I write, because I have the memory of goldfish. I don't remember things. And your first question was about
So can intercultural dialogue can only be public
by state and non-state
Yeah.
actors. Yeah. Um, that's actually a very good question, and it's a very formative question to ask, right? Because who does intercultural dialogue is very important to how people participate, right? So intercultural dialogue as of now is it's more like a thing which is on paper, right? So you do not so the first time that intercultural dialogue was introduced was by UNESCO, which happens to be a transnational non-state actor, so to speak, right? The United Nations, it's one of the wings of the United Nations. And UNESCO developed something called the White Paper on Intercultural Dialogue. So they talk about it as a very formative framework, right? People should do this and then they should do that. But what they don't do is that they do not tell you who will do it and how they'll do it, right? So this is, like I said, this was a major challenge for me because you know that something exists, but then you don't know who wants to apply it, how they want to apply it. And that is kind of the potential of ICD. Like, for example, now I have done, there's one study where intercultural dialogue has happened. I have a proper practical methodology, research design, and if somebody were to come to me and ask me, then how did you do intercultural dialogue? And I'd say that, this is how I approached it, this is what I did, and this is what the outcome was. So the results can now be picked up. And these can be picked up by anyone. So they can be picked up by a state actor, by a non-state actor, and they can do whatever they want to do with the results that I see. So if another non-state actor were to pick it up, then it would be about the scope. Where are they applying it? Do they want to do it like within a particular community, within a country, within a continent, right? The scope. And then if a government picks it up, how do they want to do it? Like, are they going to first test it and then probably transform it into a policy? Or what do they want to do? So it's open to both. It's like you choose what you want to do with it because now it's been done once. So anybody can do whatever they want to do with, whether they are non-state actors. And the second question was about Israel and Palestine. So I did not say that we can do it there. If you go back to what I have been trying to say constantly is that context is very important, right? And when I say context is very important, like whenever I speak, I always say that context is queen. So context decides what happens and where it happens. So in the context of Philistine and Israel, it's a very violent conflict, right? It's extremely violent conflict. And like I said, like I figured out a way where I was able to find people who were willing to speak to each other, and then they were in the diaspora, so they were removed from the consequences, from the direct consequences of the conflict, right? And when you're removed from the direct consequences of the conflict, there's more likelihood of you wanting to speak. So this is not the case with with what's happening in Gaza or what's happening in Palestine. And it's not like they've not had their trial at dialogue. I mean, it's one of the most heavily documented dialogic situations in whole of the world, right? You will find thousands of studies where there was interpersonal dialogue, there was intergroup dialogue, but regardless, the conflict continues to persist. So I did not say that we can do it there. What I said is that context decides what happens. And in my context, I was able to do it because we figured out ways around it. We figured out a safe space. We figured out a research design which helped us. And things eventually worked out in my favor, but they may not work out in other contexts, right? It's not. I cannot claim replication. This is qualitative research, right? This is not quantitative research. And the thing with qualitative research is that it's not generalizable. And one of the important things I talk about in my conclusion is about context, that context driven, your approach, your understanding about intercultural dialogue has to be contextual.
Thank you.
That's Professor Mike, my mentor.
I'm so late, I'm so sorry.
Ada lagi mau bertanya? Atau mungkin mau disummarize dulu jawabannya? Iya. Mau nanya? Oke, boleh. Oh. Boleh. Nanti dibantu. But then, may I say that for the first patient from Finland, is it like so? It's principally start from ourselves first, literally. So maybe when we talk about the contacts, it might be like the other person, like we're trying to open ourselves, but then the other person are not really next to it. But then at least from us, your suggestion is more like from us, at least we start to open it and then show inspire and then we're ya. Untuk pertanyaan itu lebih ke bagaimana bahkan kalau misalnya di konteks kampus seperti teman-teman ya, di kampus juga kita sangat bertemu dengan teman-teman yang beragam kayak gitu, dan kadang-kadang bisa jadi kita pun tidak mau berkontak ataupun berinteraksi panjang dengan satu sama lain karena mungkin ada sentimen-sentimen sudah banyak satu sama lain kayak gitu kan. Jadi kemudian apa yang kemudian bisa dilakukan gitu. Sebenarnya sih yang tadi aku dapatkan mungkin kita sudah dapat yang lebih mendalam ya. Tapi yang tadi aku dapatkan paling tidak dari kitanya harus memulai lebih dulu gitu. Harus kita yang menunjukkan dan harus kita yang memperlihatkan bahwa kita tidak menjudge mereka, kita pengen mendengarkan mereka, kita pengen memahami mereka, kita pengen berinteraksi dengan satu sama lain kayak gitu. Jadi suggestionnya lebih ke bagaimana dari kita dulu kayak gitu ya. Oke, terima kasih juga. It's really like a soul counseling di sedikit. Terus untuk Aldi tadi baik yang jawabannya kan ya. Aldinya teman-teman butuh ditranslate juga. Ya, oke. Jadi pertanyaan pertama itu tentang secara sederhananya adalah apakah intercultural dialogue itu bisa diaplikasikan ataupun dijalankan oleh state actor atau aktor negara ya kayak gitu, ataupun non state actor kayak gitu kan. Dan jawaban menurut saya lebih ke saya membuat penelitian terkait intercultural dialogue ini, dan ini bisa diadopsi oleh siapa saja kayak gitu ya. Tapi mungkin yang aku juga pengen tekankan adalah state actor itu manusia juga, individu juga, ya kan? Orang-orang diplomat kita yang merepresentasikan kita adalah manusia, individu, representasi yang menganggap yang kita anggap adalah representasi dari apa yang ingin dibawa oleh Indonesia, kayak gitu. Jadi tetap saja orang yang melakukan interaksi tetap manusia, individu manusia juga, kayak gitu. Dan makanya konteks dari intercultural dialogue itu bisa diaplikasikan baik state actors maupun non state actors karena ya dulunya sama-sama manusia, kayak gitu. Terus yang kedua adalah tentang lebih ke bagaimana tentang di Israel Palestina ya kayak gitu. Tadi menurut saya lebih lagi-lagi meng-highlight soal kemudian orang-orang diaspora ini pada akhirnya bisa lebih terbuka memang karena ada distance, karena ada jarak kayak gitu. Jadi memang tergantung lagi dengan konteksnya seperti apa, dan Israel Palestina itu sendiri pun mereka betul-betul very violence kayak gitu kan sekarang. Tapi kalau misalnya kita mau mencari, sebetulnya ada beberapa organisasi sudah di Israel Palestina itu yang membuka jalur untuk orang-orang Israel Palestina maupun mungkin Israel Arab dan Israel Jews kayak gitu ya, untuk berdiskusi dan berdialog satu sama lain bahkan di tanah Palestinanya itu sendiri kayak gitu. Ada kemudian kalau salah aku kalau bisa teman-teman cari, ada organisasi di mana jadi orang tua, kemudian anak-anaknya itu kalau terlibat attack kayak gitu lah. Dan jadi akhirnya kedua anak, jadi orang Israel dan orang Palestina ini anak-anak mereka meninggal karena konflik yang terjadi, tapi kemudian orang tuanya memutuskan bahwa kita nggak bisa kayak gini terus, dan mereka lebih memilih untuk membangun jalur perdamaian kayak gitu. Tapi yang jadi menarik satunya adalah kita perlu bertanya orang-orang seperti apa yang kemudian lebih mau untuk menjalankan perdamaian dan orang-orang seperti apa yang tidak mau untuk melakukan itu. Karena kalau melihat dari kasusnya Musa sendiri pun ada orang-orang yang not willing untuk ikutan FGD ini kan. Tapi ada juga yang mau kayak gitu, yang mana kita bisa bertanya lebih lanjut kalau misalkan ini, tapi boleh dari Jacqueline dulu. Iya, oke. So I done the construction the conversation is now. But so but now we have another one. Yes.
Ya, jadi pada saat ini saya sedang melakukan penelitian yang sebenarnya itu sangat amat dekat ya dengan tema ini, karena saya itu menggunakan tema dan melihat subjek sebagai Muslim Tionghoa di Indonesia dan bagaimana itu bisa imply as in a business related environment gitu. Jadi I see this method as something I can use with penelitian gini gitu ya, as my research. So dari yang saya tangkap ini, metode ini tuh bisa saya gunakan untuk kayak build trust and empathy dari informan-informan saya gitu ya. Namun informan saya ini tuh sangat, bisa dibilang layersnya itu sangat banyak gitu ya, lebih banyak, dan as complicated as it is, mau nanya gitu ya, apakah metode ini tuh bisa saya gunakan untuk build that trust with the environment, as in like in business environment, and also they cannot be conducted as in like an FGD, like we have, you know, kayak bisa diorganisir oleh saya sendiri gitu sebagai peneliti, karena they are more generationally gitu, lebih berbeda gitu dari saya gitu. Jadi lebih tua gitu mbak, bisa dibilang. Jadi I would want to ask if this method is
boleh jelasin nggak layersnya tadi dimaksud apa?
Layersnya adalah mereka itu adalah orang Chinese di Indonesia dan menjadi orang Islam dengan
Jadi mualaf atau jadi
mualaf, ya mostly, and in Indonesia we also have so many social political like you know so it's really like confusing to me, and also it's very hard to like grasp how I should apply this method gitu. Misalkan nggak gitu loh mbak.
Tapi yang diajak seperti siapa? Apakah naskah mereka?
Ya, antara mereka, I want to know how they use their identity in the business relation gitu. Jadi as in them, and I want to know how they do it.
Oh, oke. Tapi berarti sebetulnya dia perlu ngambil intercultural dialect metode ya.
Ya,
Berarti kayak emang pengen sendiri research tentang bagaimana mereka menggunakan identitas mereka.
yes.
Dan itu kan layer ya, apakah maksudnya jadi apakah mereka menggunakan identitas muslim mereka, identitas mereka, atau identitas yang lebih ya udah.
Dan aku sebagai researcher juga harus tahu gimana cara mengambil datanya gitu ya. Jadi exactly. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Susie actually still searching for methods for her research, and she sees this as one of the options. So her research is more about Chinese Muslim Indonesians, and it's kind of have some kind of historic layers because there's some kind of discrimination against people from Chinese descent
Yes, but then these Chinese people, they became Muslims afterwards. So initially, not like maybe the religion was something else, but then they became Muslims afterwards. So what she wants to search is more about when they do business, the Chinese Muslims, Indonesians, how do they use their identities? Like, do they use their Chinese identity? Since it's more maybe like in trade or like in commerce, it's more famous that way, like using your Chinese collections or else, or like do they use their Muslims identity or do they use like something else? So that's why she likes asking you from the methodological perspective. This intercultural dialogue is a method that she can use it. But then another issue is these people are more older than her. So there is like a relation, a bit like a power relation in a way that since she is respectful to elders, but then if she wants to conduct like a FGD, well, how do she instruct these older people to like talking about things? So let's get it like that.
Thank you for your question. I think what I understood from what Fika very kindly translated is that you want to kind of do your research with these Chinese Muslims and you want to try to understand that which identity do they kind of give more importance to, which identity is more salient for them. So what you're trying to understand that is how do you conduct focus groups with them? Yes.
Yes.
So you're finding it difficult because there's an age.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to like gain information from my research.
Also, they don't trust you. That's the issue.
I don't know because it's like a business related thing for them. You know.
I think this is more of a technical question than about research methodology. I think when you kind of approach participants to recruit them, trust is a very important thing, particularly if it's in a situation or context where you already feel like maybe they're not very keen to be interviewed, or maybe they feel like there's some threat associated with it, or maybe they don't trust you as a researcher. So what worked for me is that I try to address all their fears, right? If they're asking me questions, I'll answer all their questions. So there was I very briefly discussed about ethics, right? So the ethics of engagement and the ethics of research become very important for you here. So if your participant does not trust you, or you're still trying to build that trustful relationship with someone you're trying to recruit, just be as open as possible, right? Like answer their questions and give them that agency that if they want to withdraw, like if there's like today they agree, like, okay, you can come and interview us. And tomorrow they say that I don't want to be interviewed. Or there's another possibility that you interview them and then they want to withdraw their data. They tell you that you can't use their data. So you have to give them full freedom of choice. They have to know that they're safe, their data is safe. They don't need to feel mistrustful of you. So when you go to them next time, just speak to them. Like, don't speak to them like a researcher from a fancy university. Like, speak to them on their level. Understand why they don't want to be interviewed, right? What are their fears? And if they have that conversation with you, you're already halfway there. So once they open up about their fears, you can do something to kind of address those fears, right? You can talk to them and give them freedom of choice. They can consent to what they want and what they don't want. So I think you'll have better results if you approach it from their perspective rather than from this like, very top down. I'm a university researcher and you're a old Chinese businessman. Like, just get down to their level, try and understand why they're doing what they're doing. And once you understand that, you understand their fears, you can work around it, right?
Amalia? Aman? Okay. Thank you. Terima kasih banyak. Ada lagi teman-teman yang mau bertanya? Silakan. Yeah, of course, of course.
So, dulu saya berbicara bahasa Indonesia. So, but I understand what you said. The issue that you raised in these last two questions is really important, very significant. I think these are very strong questions. Identity matters. Our identity is complex. And we know from your question, we can sometimes choose which identity we wish to make visible and which we want to keep hidden. That is often the discussion around hijab. This is you are very visible with your identity. If you go to another place, you might find it more comfortable to be less visible. That's an interesting debate. But as Arusha said, when we're in the search, we must remain very clear, keeping a set of rules, set of very clear processes. The first is we must be open. So, as an interviewer, as a researcher, you must be very visible with all your identities. A scholar, I'm a woman, I'm interested, I had bad experiences, worried, all your feelings and emotions be open. Second, be humble. As Arusha said, allow the power to shift to the participant. You are asking questions. Give them space. Respect their space. Be very grateful for whatever you've done. And the third is to continue to be curious and ask questions. If you don't understand their reaction, if they're hostile, ask them why. Is there a problem? So be open, be humble, be yourself, and be curious. Those four things, in my experience, really help. But remember that identity is important, but it's very complex. So I am a man, I'm an old man, a grandfather, support Manchester United, and sorts of things I can describe myself. In any one moment, one of my identities will emerge as the very visible. Now it's the academic. There's another time when I'm having coffee, we can talk about something. So thank you very much for hosting Dr. Ous. She's a very special colleague, as I'm sure has shared some of her wisdom and her experience as a researcher. Thank you. I apologize for being late. And the meeting in Central Jakarta, and it took me 2 hours. Good job. Much.
Thank you so much. Untuk ditentukan, ya. Paling untuk tadi ya. Because if you need your identity, it brings you to a vulnerable place. Also, right? So it just also means that being a researcher, you need to be more ready to be vulnerable. Let's say in this kind of external things, Alright. Jadi beberapa prinsipnya tadi ya kita ketika memang mau membuat apalagi mau untuk membuka interaksi dengan orang lain apalagi yang kaitannya dengan identitas itu sangat kompleks tentu saja gitu tapi akan baik sekali penelitinya untuk bisa lebih open terutama sangat transparan terhadap siapa dia kayak gitu jadi ketika kamu mau meneliti soal identitas sangat baik sekali kalau kamu juga terbuka akan identitas kamu itu siapa. Kamu perempuan, kamu jadi suku mana, kamu kemudian sukanya apa, kamu tuh kenapa tertarik dan penelitian ini, ada jadi kayak gitu. Jadi orang pun juga bisa building karena mereka tahu paling tidak kamu tuh latar belakangnya apa, siapa, dan apa yang kamu sadari dari posisi yang kamu. Karena kan kadang-kadang ini ya, misalkan di penelitian di UK sekalipun biasanya ada beberapa misalkan peneliti yang memang basisnya di Barat kemudian dia harus cerita juga kenapa kemudian dia tertarik misalkan untuk peneliti global south dan dia harus juga mengakui kenapa dia yang dari Barat ini ada ketertarikan apa ke global south kayak gitu sementara pun dia juga harus aware bahwa ada power relation antara anggaplah ini yang peneliti yang ada di global north ataupun global south kayak gitu. Jadi itu akan sangat membantu dan itu berkaitan dengan poin yang kedua yaitu tentang humble. Dan itu adalah kenapa kita terbuka itu juga kaitannya dengan bagaimana kita harus humble dan kita sebagai orang yang melakukan peneliti bukan berarti kita adalah orang yang tahu segalanya enggak. Kita meneliti justru karena kita tidak tahu dan makanya dari orang-orang yang datang untuk berbagi perspektif mereka di sharing itu posisi kita adalah orang yang belajar dari mereka kayak gitu. Jadi makanya kita pun juga terbuka atas apa yang mereka jelaskan tapi kemudian kita pun juga curious mungkin agak cukup butuh keberanian ya teman-teman. Misalkan tadi Prof memberikan contohnya adalah kalau misalkan memang mereka kelihatan cukup marah atau cukup hostile, kita harus punya keberanian dan curiosity dia untuk bertanya, oh kenapa misalkan pertanyaan atau topik ini membuat kamu marah kayak gitu dan semoga pada kita itu bisa memberikan safe space yang baik juga kayak gitu tapi memang pada kita harus ada respect dari kita dan tadi prinsip dan jawaban untuk Vito pun juga berlaku di sini kayak gitu kita harus sebagai peneliti harus memulai itu dulu yang pada itu bisa memberikan safe space untuk orang yang ikutan FGD ini kayak gitu ya untuk pada mereka bisa lebih yes. Thank you so much. Ada lagi pertanyaan teman-teman sebelum mungkin kita tutup ada mau bertanya juga just two guys okay silakan ibu
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
It is already I know that our students are really enthusiastic to listen to your presentation. I know for the offline presentation and also we also did online every seminar and I see so many participants in Zoom meeting and I think they are all interested in your presentation. From students also that you already inspired them. So thank you very much and also welcome to Professor. Yeah, we are really happy and hopefully this is not the only you will come again, come again. So anytime you visit Ciputat and Rawon, Jakarta, and thank you very much. And hopefully we will meet you.
Baik, terima kasih banyak. Thank you so much. Stay. Yes.
I'm not very good at closing statements. I often have to be told to stop talking, and Professor Mike and Aruma both testimony to that. But thank you so much for being present here. I really have a lot of food for thought. Thank you for your questions, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me speak as much as I enjoyed speaking to you all. Thank you. Terrible pass away.
So much. Thanks once again, please. Silakan Haji, tolong ya. Berkomunikasi. Thank you so much. Belum sampai Pak Faisal. Dilanjut aja dulu. Ya, oke. Baik, terima kasih banyak teman-teman semuanya kalau sudah mengikuti jalannya acara kita 2 jam ya. Semoga ada banyak yang bisa diambil dari perjalanannya pada hari ini. Kalau misalkan ada pertanyaan-pertanyaan lagi, silakan disampaikan. So, if they have communications, can we like something to your email maybe? There's like a presentation. Yes, thank you so much. Oke, nanti abis ini juga kita akan share beberapa slide-nya ya. Mungkin akan gitu juga. Kontaknya ada di akhir, jadi kalau misalnya ada teman-teman pertanyaan sama langsung ke proses langsung dikirim aja. Baiklah, kita lebih maaf teman-teman, sama ada banyak masalah teknis yang udah hari ini. Oh, sekali dari kami mohon maaf saja dari panitia. Terima kasih banyak. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Atau saya boleh ke online audience? Foto, dokumentasinya. Oke, jadi
Foto, mau. Setelah terima kasih.
Guys, kalau yang mau ikutan foto, sampai Okay.